Hey folks, welcome. So I'm here on make.com. It used to be called Integromat, but they recently went through a renaming. You could also start with something like a Zapier, but to be honest, all the basic concepts are the same and it doesn't matter which tool you use. What only matters is the apps that you're looking to automate are compatible with the automation tool that you use. And Make is pretty robust, so we are going to go ahead and use Make. So this is the homepage, just a marketing website, and you can see all the different features and all the different use cases that they have mentioned here, some nice graphics. But what matters to us is the actual automation editor. So we will get to it by signing in. I already have an account, so I'm going to go ahead and click here, sign in to Make. And my account is created with Google, so I'm just going to click on sign in with Google. If you don't have one, you'll go through the standard setup process. Okay, so here we are. This is the dashboard. When you are logged in, you are greeted with a bunch of different information. You have some graphs here that show you your usage, and this will obviously depend how much usage you have available. It will depend on the plan that you have chosen. Up top, you see a bunch of tabs, and these are mostly to do with your team, some users that are part of your team, your subscription options, and so on and so forth. And then here you see a list of some active scenarios that are currently part of your Make ecosystem and are actually running. And then on the left you have a navigation bar, which is where you will be spending most of the time to switch between scenarios, templates, to identify your existing connections and verify them, looking at what webhooks you have as part of your workflows, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so pretty typical dashboard. The idea is to make all the information available to you in one snapshot. But yeah, let's go ahead and look at some of these navigation options here. Scenarios is just the same thing as workflows. Make chose to call them scenarios, but at the end of the day, they're just your automation workflows. And then we have some templates. I'll go back to scenarios in a sec because we'll actually create a scenario later in this video. But let's look at the templates first. So templates are essentially automation workflows that people have built. These are just Make users who have built these workflows, and they have chosen to share these with other Make users so that they can leverage these workflows as well. So these are a great source of inspiration. You don't have to use them, or you can use them and then extend them. It's totally up to you, but it's a great way to just browse here and see what all is available, what are the kinds of things that people do. And it's a great way to just spark ideas for things that you could automate yourself. You could also filter it down by a particular app that you might have in mind. For example, I want to see if there's something around weather that I can do, and there's a couple of weather apps here, so I'll click on one of them and see, okay, what kind of workflows people have built using these applications. So yeah, so you can search for your favorite app or app that you have in mind to automate, and then take the inspiration and go from there. Okay, so let's keep going here. Next up is connections. So connections are all the apps that I have authorized Make to call on my behalf. So it's a pretty typical authentication process. Whenever you're going to automate an application, you need to authorize Make to call it on your behalf. And these are just a list of all the connections that I've made already. And sometimes if you're facing an issue with one of the connections, you can come here and verify. It might ask you to enter your credentials again and then fix the issue. Yeah, so just a list, and you can always come here and verify, or if you want to delete a connection, you can do that as well. And then, yeah, so we don't have to go through the other ones here because they will come up as we start building some automations. But for now, what I would like to do is go back to the scenarios tab and actually create a new scenario. And here also you can filter by active or inactive scenario, and then you can organize your scenarios into different folders. So I'm going to click on the demos folder, and to create a new scenario, all I have to do is click on the plus create a new scenario button here up top. So let's go ahead and do that. And there we go. Our canvas is ready. This is where we are going to be building our automations. So what all is going on here? First of all, I would like to point out it's a pretty flexible canvas, and that's one of the reasons I like Make. It's if you have used a tool like Figma or Sketch or any other flowchart tool, it's pretty similar. It's an infinite canvas. You can zoom in and zoom out, and you can drag things around. So that's the first part. The other part is all the options that we have here at bottom. So by default, every new scenario that you create is has a scheduled trigger. So for example, you see here, it runs every 15 minutes. Obviously this one is turned off right now, but once it's turned on, it will run every 15 minutes. So that's an example of a scheduled workflow. But as you change things, as you add applications and triggers here, this might reflect the latest settings based on your workflow. And you could also change the settings by clicking on it. So that's the sort of to identify how and when your workflow is actually running. Next, we have the save button just to save any changes. We have a settings button where it asks you also a bunch of questions about whether your data is confidential, whether you want to store the data about incomplete executions, and so on and so forth. And these all will make sense as you build new workflows and certain requirements come up. Okay, so I'll come back to the rest of them here in a second, but first, let's go ahead and add a few things to the workflow. And to add, we just click on the plus icon here. And typically in a workflow, the first thing you add is a trigger, because unless there's a trigger, there can't be an action. So for the trigger, what I'll use is, maybe we can use a webhook. And I'll create a webhook here. And so what happens is whenever you add a new application or a new trigger here, then it asks you to fill a form to tell me how are you going to use this particular application. And since it's a webhook, it's asking me which webhook you want to use. As you can see, there's a list of all the webhooks that I've already created, but I'm going to go ahead and create a new one as if I did not have one. And then it asks you what do you want to name this webhook. So I'll just say dummy webhook and save. And then it gives me a URL, and this is a URL that is going to be invoked if we want to trigger this workflow. So I hit OK. And as you see, now my scheduling settings have changed to reflect the latest trigger, which is a webhook. And webhook by definition is supposed to be immediate because it's an on-demand trigger. So this setting has changed to reflect my latest settings in the workflow. Okay, perfect. And then what you do is then when you have your trigger in place, then you need an action. And to add an action, you just click on the plus icon. And then this could be any app that you want to use in the workflow. So for example, I want to maybe send an email. So I can look for Gmail, and then I'll say, what do you want to do? I'll say, send an email. And then it'll ask me to set up the account and go and fill out some details. But we'll get into that as we build our projects. For now, I'll just hit OK. It's not letting me save because it's saying these fields are mandatory. That's okay because we will actually spend a lot of time in this editor. So all of this will become clear. But for now, I just wanted to show you how this looks. The next thing I want to show you is that you can drag these things around to match whatever setup you have in mind. And if you notice, there's a wrench icon here between the two applications on the path. And if you click on that, you get a bunch of options which are specific to this particular connection. So you can do things like unlink, or basically break this connection, add a router. You can add a module. We'll also talk about this in the later videos. And then you could also add a note about this particular connection if you want to just write something to remember what this connection was all about. So you can do that as well. And then finally, I wanted to remind you of the types of triggers that are generally available to us when implementing an automation workflow. So here on the screen, as you can see, I've laid out the 3 types of triggers. We talked briefly about them in a previous lesson, but let me give you a quick recap. So there's the on-demand triggers, there's the scheduled triggers, and there's the app event-based triggers. So on-demand triggers are essentially when we want a workflow to run and run on demand. It's self-explanatory. Scheduled is when we create a workflow and then set a time on it for it to run on a given frequency. And then the final one is the app event, which is essentially a trigger which starts a workflow based on an event that takes place within an app. So for our first project, we will be focusing on the app events based trigger. And let me introduce you to the scenario that we are going to be automating. So let me move over to the right here. Okay, so here's the scenario or workflow. It's the same thing. So what I want to do, or what I want to automate rather in this scenario is whenever I get invited to an event and I receive that event in my calendar, and we'll be using Google Calendar for this demo, I want to create a task in my to-do application, and I use Todoist. So essentially, anytime I get invited to an event and I receive the notification in Google Calendar, I want to create a corresponding task in my to-do application, which is List. And for the to-do itself, what I want to automate is the adding of the description for the task and also when the task is due date. So essentially what I'm trying to automate is that anytime there's a meeting that I'm invited to, I want to make sure that I have it in my to-do list to prepare ahead of time for the meeting. And the due date is essentially going to be the time of the meeting. So that's first very basic automation. And then we are going to build upon it, and we are going to add some categorization of the task as well. So in this next step, what we will do is, so the first one, we are just creating a task. But in the next step, we also want to identify if the meeting description matches a certain criteria. And if it happens to be of a type one-on-one, like a one-on-one meeting, we want to also categorize the task in Todoist and apply a label on it that says one-on-one. So that's the background. And now we're going to flip over to the Make editor and start building our first workflow. So let's go ahead and click on the Make tab over here. And I already have my Google Calendar as well as my Todoist applications open as well, because we will need them for the testing purposes. Okay, so here I've organized my Make Studio a little bit. So I have created a folder called Demos, which is where I will be working for the most part for our videos. And for this particular one, I'm going to go ahead and click on Create a New Scenario, because we're starting from scratch. We're not using a template in this case, so we'll just click on Create a New Scenario. And that brings us to the canvas. Okay, so we are ready to implement. And so whenever we implement a workflow, there are two things involved. There is the trigger, which is our calendar event here on the left, and then there's actions. So actions could be one or more. In our case, it's just only to be one action, which is of creating a task, the Todoist application, but there could be one or more. And that essentially the combination of them forms the workflow. So first thing first, we need to set up our trigger. So how do we do that? So let me switch back over here. So since our trigger is of type app, it's an app event, we can just click on this plus icon, because when you click on this plus icon, what you get is a list of applications. And that's exactly what we want, because our trigger is just of type app. So we look for the app that we want to use as the trigger. So I'm literally just going to type here Google Calendar, and it shows me this option because there's only one Google Calendar. So I click on this, and then whenever you select an app from the dropdown, you get sort of everything that Make can do with this particular application. So up top, you have all the events that this app supports. So any of these could be used as a trigger, or they have a bunch of actions that you can take in Google Calendar from Make. For example, getting a calendar, creating a calendar, updating a calendar, and so on and so forth. But what we need for our scenario is literally to get notified whenever there is a new event invite in our calendar. So for that, over here, there's an event called Watch Events, and it's going to pretty much just watch for events to take place in Google Calendar, and Google Calendar will then notify Make that, hey, there was a new event that just came in. So this is me notifying you, and then you can do whatever you need to do. So this is where when we click on this button and set up our Google Calendar with Make, we are essentially subscribing to events from Google Calendar. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Watch Events. And then you get this nice little pop-up with a bunch of settings. And the first thing it usually asks is which calendar you want to use. Now, I've already connected my demo Gmail, but if you haven't connected it yet, you will click on the Add button, and then you will go through the steps to essentially authenticate with your Google Calendar, and then Make will store your information so that it can call Google Calendar or talk to Google Calendar on your behalf. But since I've already connected my account, we will skip that step. And then you get a bunch of questions here that what kind of events you're looking at, which calendar you want me to be paying attention to, do you want me to look at deleted events or not, and if you want to query for a particular type of events, and how many events you want me to process every time I get notified. We'll start from the top here, and I just want to use my primary calendar because that's the only meaningful calendar in my Google Calendar. So I select that, and then it says watch events. I create a date, update date, starting date, or ending date. So we'll just, because we want to process them as they are created, we'll just click on create a date. And what these mean, you can read the documentation and it will tell you exactly which one to use in which scenario. And there will be a bunch of these situations in any different apps that you use. So the best place to understand which one to select is looking at the Make documentation. But for now, we'll use the create a date. I don't care about deleted events for now, no query, and then how many events I'm expecting to process per cycle. I'm just going to change it to 1 because I don't have that much activity going on in my calendar. If I was receiving multiple invites per minute or per 15 minutes, I would be increasing the limit. But for now, we can just go with 1 because I'll just be creating 1 event to test this workflow. Okay, so click OK. And there we go. So our Google Calendar has been set up as a trigger. So this part of the automation is done. And now what's left is creating an action that should take place whenever Make is notified of a new event in my Google Calendar. Okay, so let's click on plus here. So essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to make this connection, and we click on plus, and this is where we start creating our actions. And our action is going to be the Todoist, something that we want to do in the Todoist application. So I'm going to go ahead and search for Todoist, click on that, and then same thing, a nice pop-up shows up, and it's asking me, what action do you want to take? Whenever this workflow is running, what do you want me to do? And my action is pretty straightforward, but you can see all the options that you have here. It's pretty incredible, everything that you can do. But for now, we're just going to click on create a task. And then same thing, it's going to ask me what kind of task, what do you want to call it, and all the information that Todoist expects whenever a new task is getting created. So now you might be wondering, we need this information. We need the task description, we need the due date in Todoist. We need to provide this information to Todoist. But how does it get there? So that's where sort of this editor that Make has provided helps, because by making this connection, everything that Google Calendar has sent to Make will be available for us to use on the Todoist side. So when I click on content, which is essentially the name of my task in Todoist world, it shows me everything that it received from Google Calendar. All these things came in from a Google Calendar event. So I can look for description, and that is essentially the description of my Google Calendar event. Or I think there's another one called summary. There we go. So there's a summary as well. So we can play around with them, but for now, I'm just going to use the summary. And when I click on this, I can literally just drag it in the content space here, and that will take whatever text it received from Google Calendar and provide that to Todoist. So that's a summary. But we can also add our own text to it. So since we're creating a task based on an event, I will say prepare for, and then whatever the name of the event is in Google Calendar, it'll say prepare for so and then I'll add meeting at the end on my behalf. So the summary, you can think of it as a variable that is coming, and the value will be provided by Google Calendar. Okay, so that's the name of the task. For project, we'll just select inbox because we will be sending all the tasks to the Todoist inbox. This is Todoist speak, so we don't have to worry too much about the details, but we'll just say all the tasks should go to our inbox. We'll leave the labels alone for now. We'll come back to it in a second. And then the other piece of information that we needed is the due date. So again, I want the due date to be before my meeting or at the time of my meeting, because I don't want to be reminded of this task after the meeting is already done. So the due date is just going to be whenever my meeting is going to begin. So I can look for, based on a date, I can look for the start time. And this is again coming from Google Calendar. There should also be other types of dates here. We have the original start time. Let's take a look. Okay, that should be fine for now. So we'll just take the original start time and drag it to the date section here in Todoist. And then we'll also change this to date and time, because I want in Todoist the due date and time to be exactly the time of my meeting. And then it says a human readable representation of the due date. I'm going to use the same thing, and we might have to change it when we run it, because this information gets updated when the actual events take place. This is what Make knows of Google Calendar app right now. But when Google Calendar sends real information, sometimes this information changes based on how Google Calendar has changed or decided to change the information it is sending. But for now, we'll stick to whatever is provided to us. So we'll say original start time here, and then, and then it's asking me, is it a recurring event? I'll just leave that as is. Yeah, so that's it for now. So we'll click on OK. And so we have pretty much created our first workflow, which is we have the trigger here on the left, which is our Google Calendar. And then we have the action here which is creating a task in Todoist. So the only thing that's left to do now is to test it. So before we actually turn this workflow on, it's typically advised to test it, because once you turn it on, then the floodgates are open, and anytime a new event comes in, you'll start creating tasks. But we're not ready to do that yet. We don't know if our configuration is successful and it's what we are expecting. So before we go ahead and turn on the workflow, which is pretty much when the floodgates open and anytime a new Google Calendar event is created, a task will be created, it is a good idea to test the workflow. And to do that, what we need to do is go to Google Calendar and create a test event. So I'm going to create a test event here and call it, let's say, stand up. So I'll just call this meeting stand up, 12 p.m. to 15 minutes is enough. And I will save. Okay, so now the meeting is on my calendar. So now I want to test, had this workflow been running, will I get an event or will I get a task created in my Todoist application for this particular event? So to do that, I'm just going to click on run once, and it will just look at Google Calendar for a few minutes and see if there's any new events, pull them in, and then process them. Let's click on play, and that is going to, so it seems like it went through. As you can see, Google Calendar is in green. So let's go over to Todoist and see what we got. And voila. So we got a task created called prepare for stand-up meeting. And let's see if we have any other information in it. So the project seems to be correct. That is inbox. But notice that we did not get a due date, and that's okay. And usually when you prepare a workflow like this, there could be some misconfiguration, and then that's the whole idea of testing. So we go back and then address why we did not get our due date. So let's go back to make and click on Todoist. So if you remember, we had added an original start time for both the date and the human readable representation of due date. But I had mentioned that this might not be the right configuration because I've seen this happen before, because sometimes Google Calendar will change how it sends the information to make. So let's click on this again and see what all came in from Google Calendar. And this time we actually see the real data. So it's a little bit easier to work with. And if you notice that I got a created time, I got an updated time, but this is when the event was created. What I'm after is when the event starts. So I can just take, instead of the original start time, I can just take the start variable and then work with that. And then I'm going to use the same for the human readable representation as well, because this to me at least is human readable. Sometimes there's a timestamp that is more numeric and not human readable. So let's click on OK. So let's click on OK. And then now let's create another event. And this time I'll say retrospective from 1 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. Save. And I'm going to run it again. So it seems like it went through. Both of the apps are in green, the Google Calendar as well as Todoist. And this one over here shows me like how many events were processed and how many actions were taken. So let's go ahead and move back to Todoist and see what we got there. So it seems like I got the task created called prepare for retrospective meeting. And this time I also got the due date successfully with it, which is at 1 p.m. today. So let's go back to the Miro board and see what else we had discussed. So this part is complete. We got the event, we got the task, we got the description as well as the due date. And the next thing we had talked about is the categorization of the task. So what I want to do is anytime a Google Calendar event comes in with one-on-one in its description, I wanted to create a task in Todoist with the label one-on-one. And for that, what I'll have to do is I'll have to introduce some kind of a filtering mechanism here, as I've shown in the diagram here, so that we can test if the description does contain the tag one-on-one in it. If so, then add the label, otherwise just create a regular task. So how do we do that? So we need to add this little piece here in the middle, and in make, it's called a router. Since I'm adding something in the middle here, what I'll do is I right click here and it'll give me a few options as to what is it that I'm looking to do. I can either add a filter, I can unlink the two modules, or I can add a module. And finally, I can also add a router, because that is what we need to decide which way we want to go. So I'll add a router. And there we go. So we get this router here in the middle. And by the way, you can drag these things around as much as you want. It doesn't matter because there's this tiny little button here called auto align. which then brings everything back together. And you can zoom in and zoom out as well. So let's create some space here. Okay, perfect. So what I want to do in the router is, so currently it doesn't make any sense because it's just going linearly like this. Everything that will go through the router will go eventually to the same Todoist task. So we need to add a route. And you do that by clicking on the plus icon here. So now it is starting to look like what we discussed here, which is we have two types of actions. One is a regular create task and one is a create task with category. Okay. How do we decide what is going on here versus what is going on there? Okay. So first of all, let's go ahead and add Todoist to this second one as well. And same thing, create a task. And everything else here is also going to be similar. For content, we'll take the summary and add pair for meeting. And in this one, for the label, we will also use the one-on-one label because we will only go into this route whenever it matches a certain criteria, which we will add in a second. And then same thing for date and time. We'll use the start variable and then here as well. Okay, I go to the back, click on OK. So now we have our task created with one-on-one and everything else is exactly the same. Okay, so how do we decide what goes here, what goes here? So we'll use this tiny little button here to add a filter. And essentially, we'll say you only go here when you match a certain criteria. So click on set up a filter. And the filter is essentially, we are looking for the description. We are going to read the description and say if the description contains the word one-on-one, which is like 1:1. Because typically when I get one meetings, and this could be different for you, but typically when I get one-on-one meetings, they have the word one-on-one in it. So I'm just going to look for that. If they do, then it will go here and create the meeting with the one-on-one label as we have selected here. But in this case, it will go if we only want it to go here if it doesn't contain the tag one-on-one in it. So what we'll do is we'll say set up a filter and we will say yes to the fallback route. So what it says is it will be used in the case where bundle cannot continue on from the router via any other route. So this is the fallback route, meaning if it could not go here, it will go here. So by default, it will always try to go here. But if this filter fails, then it will use this route and we can just name it fallback. And this one we can name as the one-on-one route. Okay, just to repeat, fallback is only used when the other route could not go through. So it's like a if-else. If one-on-one, go here, else go here. Okay, very good. So it's time to test this. So let's go ahead and I'm going to delete these events just to avoid any confusion. And then also let's delete these tasks as well. Okay, and now I'm going to create a one-on-one meeting. So I'll say Sahil, Joe, one-on-one, save. So that one-on-one meeting is created and the description has one-on-one in it. And when I'm running my workflow, we will basically be testing if that is available in it as well. Okay, so time to test it. The event is already created. So let's go ahead and test this setup. As always, I'm just going to click on the play button here. And okay, seems like it went through the route that I was expecting it to go through, the one-on-one route. Let's switch over to Todoist and see what we got there. And look at that. We got a task created. I did not add anything to the description, so it just says Sahil Joe one-on-one, and it says due date is 12 p.m. But so our route is working as expected. Let's make sure we fix the description as well. We'll just say prepare for meeting. And this will just get added in. Okay, so that's pretty good. So let's go back and check out our scenario. It seems like we got everything we need. We got the trigger, we got the regular create task, and we got the categorize task. I guess what we haven't tested is the fallback route. So we can do that now. Let me delete this one and I'll just add a regular event. And we'll just click on save and go back to make and run it once again. Okay, so this one did go through on this side, but seems Todoist had an error. I'm not sure what's going on with their API right now, but essentially it would have gone to the fallback route as expected, and we can see the event details here. Okay, perfect. This is pretty much good to go. We just need to name this. So we'll just click here and say Google Calendar to Todoist, since those are the apps that are being used here. And that way it's easy to identify whenever I come across this workflow anywhere. Okay, so that's pretty much it. And what we can do now is, close out this section. And then in the next section, we will work on our second project. So I'll see you there.